So we've covered the three main different types of design styles. So now let's actually talk about some of the best practices for implementing responsive design. One of the first best practices that we'll need to keep in mind as we're building out the responsive design in our applications is using relative units. So these are units like rem, percent, viewport height, and viewport width, or VH and VW. Rem is a unit based off of the HTML font size, and so based on the font size of the device, it will responsively calculate an appropriate proportional pixel value. We'll use rem for all of our font sizes and most of the widths and heights and margins for the different elements in our application. Using percentages actually allows the values to change in real time based on the screen size. So I describe that percent as being a fluid unit because it is going to move fluidly as you resize the screen and is helpful for setting up proportional values. Like if I want two elements to share the space next to each other, you could set 50% as the width on each one, and then both of those will always take up just half of the screen size available. Whereas with rem, even though it is responsive in that it's calculating a proportional value based on the font size, once that value is calculated, it's not going to change. Okay, so that's more of a static responsive unit is how I kind of think about it, whereas the percents are going to change in real time constantly as you change the size of your screen, so that's more of a fluid unit. Viewport height and viewport width are almost a sort of combination of rem and percent because they stand for viewport height and viewport width, and so they're depending on the actual size of the browser or the screen that you're on, the viewport, but similar to rem, they're going to calculate a proportional pixel value based on that screen size or height. We'll see different use cases for each of these as we build out our application. The next best practice and concept to keep in mind for responsive design is media queries. Media queries are what allow us to actually detect what screen size we're at. So we'll use media queries to say, okay, for these large screens, we're going to use 4 rem or 25%, and then on the smaller size screens, let's use 2 rem or 10%. So media queries are the mechanism that we'll actually use to implement our responsive design and to adapt based on the screen size the user is currently at. We'll use media queries in tandem with the grid system. Using a grid system, I think, is really important for responsive design because if you're not very explicit about the arrangement of your content on the screen, it makes it a lot harder to consistently and systematically arrange and adapt that content based on the screen size. So if you just have a bunch of stuff kind of thrown on the screen and there's not really a rhyme or reason to it, then it's going to be really complicated resizing and rearranging all that for other screen sizes in any sort of consistent way. Using a grid system, however, allows you to very explicitly define how large certain items should be at certain points and how they should all flow together as the screen size changes. Material UI provides us our grid system, and it is actually innately connected to their responsive design solution, making it really easy to adjust the layout of our screen and the arrangement of our content based on screen size. And finally, testing, and testing. This is really important for responsive design. We'll take a look at how we can use our in-browser tools to simulate different screen sizes and different devices so that we can ensure our application looks correct and works perfectly on all devices. So we said from adaptive design, we don't want to have to be going in and creating different styles for every different possible device or screen size that there is. However, getting it set up in the first place does require going through and just making sure we get it right the first time, and then after that, we can know that our styles will adapt correctly to all the other screen sizes that there may be. So we'll use the in-browser tools to simulate a phone screen and simulate a tablet screen, and this will help us adjust our styles using media queries so that on all of these different devices, it will adapt correctly. This will be something you'll need to get comfortable with when building out your own applications, going in and picking values, say 5 rem, and testing that out on your different screens, and then adjusting that up or down as you need until everything looks correctly. And then once you have everything looking correct for your phone screens and your tablets and your desktops, then you know it'll just continue adapting correctly for all the different devices out there. So these are the main best practices for implementing responsive design that we will rely on as we build out the front end of our application. Lastly, let's just talk about what the actual goals of responsive design are. So when we implement responsive design, our first goal is that we want our application to look perfect on all screen sizes. So we don't want to just make sure it looks good on computers or phones. We want to make sure it's going to look good on everything. That's the whole point of responsive design. Secondly, I think that when we implement responsive design, it should be orientation independent. Okay? And this is one that's probably not a hard and fast rule for everybody, but I think that this is really the case because if you've gone in and really perfectly set up responsive design to where your application knows how to adapt itself based on the screen size available, then you don't really need, or you shouldn't need, to go in and add a bunch of exceptions for, say, if a mobile device is in portrait or landscape mode. Your application should just be able to tell how much screen size it has available to it, and if the user turns the phone sideways, it should just adapt and fill up the space intelligently without even having to necessarily know that the device is sideways. I think if you find yourself in your own applications having to go in and add a bunch of different exceptions for different orientations, then you maybe need to rethink your responsive design approach because you might not be applying it correctly. There may be some edge cases and some little pieces of functionality that maybe do require you define explicitly what orientation those styles are for, but again, if you find yourself doing this frequently, then you're probably not on the right track. And lastly, this is pretty similar to looking perfect on all screen sizes, but I think it's an important distinction, and that is being resizable. Alright, so if you're on a phone screen, you really can't change the size of the screen. It's just the size that it is. But if you're on a computer, people can change the browser window to be whatever size they want. They might have a document they're taking notes in on the side, or maybe they're watching a video in a second screen that they have split with your website. And so you need to make sure that as a user resizes the browser window, that your application adapts intelligently and correctly and doesn't break your content or break functionality. Thankfully, using media queries and using responsive units will make this very easy for us. It's just something to keep in mind that we do explicitly want to make sure we support. So, armed with this knowledge and this new understanding of the concepts behind responsive design and the best practices for implementing it, let's now go ahead and in the next video take a look at how we can make our header responsive for mobile screens in the next video.